love the channel and find it useful in becoming a happy retiree. Subscribe today. Go to the phones here. Gene joins us from Powder Springs. Gene, what's going on? How can I help?
I've got a question. As part of my Vanguard retirement, I'm invested in energy and healthcare, and I've heard you talk a lot about the ETFs, okay? And I'm trying to understand, is it advantageous for me to switch my energy and my healthcare to an ETF rather than just a mutual fund, and for what reason? I mean, is it more... do they pay more dividends, or is it cost lower?
Well, okay, so a couple of thoughts here. There is a wonderfully large and complicated continuum when it comes to ETFs versus mutual funds, and I'll try to simplify it for you. Really, the reason we talk so much about ETFs is that in general, and if you take Vanguard out of the equation, in general, mutual funds, actively managed mutual funds, are run by a research team and a portfolio manager, and they're trying to outperform or beat some sort of index, Gene. And in doing so, it costs you. It costs you anywhere from 0.75% a year up to 1.5% a year. Some mutual funds are still in the 2% a year range. And the problem with that is that what we've found over time is that even though you've got typically a very smart group of people, the inherent costs of running that mutual fund drag down the performance for a lot of these actively managed funds, and it's been hard for them to beat the index. So the opposite side, so that's active investing. On the other side of that equation are passive investors that will say, look, I'm just going to go into the S&P 500 index fund that essentially has, it's not zero cost, but let's say an index fund that tracks the S&P 500 index, a mutual fund that does that, called an index fund, might only be 0.1%. So it's much cheaper. And because it doesn't have any cost, it gives it kind of this, it's running a race with it's got a backpack on it that's real light as opposed to a heavy backpack, right? Okay. So it over time, these index funds have done a good job of outpacing a lot of actively managed funds. Now, there's a lot of other commentary about that. We've been in kind of a unique environment in the last decade since the financial crisis. You've got all of this massive intervention from the government that has kind of propped everything up, right? So what that's done, quantitative easing by the Federal Reserve, it's made the system different than it's ever been. So there's been more guardrails for companies to kind of operate through this financial crisis and as this economy has come back. And I think it's made it even harder for actively managed portfolio managed in mutual funds, because it's kind of lifted all boats, and it's been harder for managers to discern. Well, we've got there's a massive amount of companies that are publicly traded that still don't make a profit, but in the last period of time, interestingly, it hasn't mattered, because there's been all this financial engineering and intervention that's propped up even bad companies. So it's been harder for portfolio managers to find winners and losers, because kind of everybody's been a winner, and that's helped make the passive route, just low cost passive. It's made it even more appealing. And the reason I talk about ETFs is that ETFs in general are a cheaper version of mutual funds. And if you've got a really inexpensive mutual fund that is now in the form of an ETF, then it gives you an advantage over time. What's happened, though, is that now we've got hundreds and hundreds, or really thousands of ETFs now. Most of them are passive. Some of them are active. But the good news for you, though, Gene, is that in general, because of the evolution of ETFs, which are an evolution of passive index funds, it's brought the cost of all these things down. And that's what matters, is that you want to make sure that the ETFs or the mutual funds that you're using have a really low cost barrier to them, or a low cost burden to them. And that's what matters. Now it doesn't matter if it's a mutual fund that's a passive mutual fund that's 0.1% a year, or an ETF that's 0.1% a year. It doesn't matter. Both are low cost. And as long as you're avoiding really high cost mutual funds, for investors, that's what matters. That's at least one of the first ways you can weed out your investments. Now, there's another conversation, and we'll get to in this hour, that whether active managers might actually do better in the next 5 years than they've done in the past. The pendulum might very well be swinging in that direction. We'll see. But for purposes of this conversation, it doesn't matter if you're using a low-cost mutual fund or a low-cost ETF. The predominance or the important piece of this equation is low cost.
Low cost. Gotcha.
And that's the point. Hi, I'm Wes Moss, and thanks for taking a minute to hear about what's so different about my new book, You Can Retire Sooner Than You Think. So unlike other retirement books, this book will give you a step-by-step guide, whether you're in your 20s or 30s or 40s or 50s, to learn from what these successful and happy retirees did to get there. I hope you enjoy the book, but more importantly, I know that it'll help you retire sooner than you think.